Good day, guys. This is a video basically on this guy called Grant Generics, who basically was interviewed by Nutrition with Judy. He basically promotes the idea that vitamin A is toxic and you don't require much or very little, which is nonsense. So I'll just bring up the point that he brings up. Let me just share this just to get a whiff of the sort of thinking of this crackpot.
This whole definition of autoimmunity is a perfect match for vitamin A toxicity. And so, if someone's experiencing autoimmune diseases, fatty liver, diabetes is hugely implicated here.
So autoimmune disease is also highly associated, and there's actually good clinical research to show that vitamin D deficiency is one of the key components. And there's a number of people in our community that have actually improved autoimmunity or reversed it completely with sorting out their vitamin D deficiency. And there's plenty of stuff in the literature. So what he's talking about, maybe these people were vitamin D deficient. First of all, he hasn't actually done any biopsy of his own liver to determine whether he's got toxicity or any of the other people that he actually are part of his little clan of crackpots. But the reality is that vitamin A is a very important. It does have some hormonal effects like vitamin D, so it's a very important element. We call it a vitamin, but it's it's all its different metabolites do have a lot of signaling or hormonal effects directly on the endocrine system, both vitamin D and all the other fat soluble vitamins. So they are pro-hormones in a sense, and it's very important to realize that in that regard. So we'll just listen to the other part of it.
Big tie-in with insulin resistance and vitamin A toxicity. People can look up what's called STRA6 receptor that's induced by vitamin A, and that induces insulin resistance. So there's a lot of diseases that I think are attributable to vitamin A toxicity.
These are all associations. Let's make it quite clear. He hasn't actually demonstrated any study. He hasn't shown any causal relationship. This is no different than any other thing. Now, basically this, which is stimulated by retinoic acid 6 gene. So this is basically, biochemical studies reveal that STRA6 is transmembrane pore with transport vitamin A bidirectionally between extra and intracellular retinol binding proteins. So retinol binding proteins are basically the thing that actually transports vitamin A out of the liver to the peripheral tissue, to the other tissue, the other cells around. So this actually regulates the sort of movements of the metabolites in that regard. Now, here's another study that actually goes into that about the STRA6 is critical for cellular vitamin A uptake and homeostasis. That means if you knock this out, things go bad very quickly. Okay, so in order to basically the proper function, because blood transport of the lipophilic vitamin is mediated by retinol binding protein. So when you see this, we're talking about the protein that brings it out. Okay, so when we look at, when we establish STR6 knockout mouse model to analyze the metabolic basis of vitamin A homeostasis peripheral tissue. So they are looking at the retinal functions. They see deterioration in there, photocell deaths, malformations, and when we look at vitamin A transport through the blood, cerebrospinal fluid barrier in the brain's cortex plexus was impaired. So notable treatment with pharmacological dose of vitamin A restored vitamin A transport across these barriers and rescued the vision of STRA6 mice. So the mice that had actually this knockout, when you gave them vitamin A, you restored. So this was a pharmacological form where you didn't have to, go through all the enzymatic pathways of converting the stuff to this sort of active form. So it's quite clear that this mechanism is really important in the body, and there's sort of the uptake. The findings identified STR6 as a bona fide vitamin A transporter have important implications for disease states associated with impaired blood A homeostasis. So this is what the findings find. These genes are very much involved in the transport of vitamin A and the regulation of vitamin A. So just because they're associated, well, ice cream sales are associated with shark attacks. That does not mean that ice cream is causal in shark attacks. This pathway, these genes are associated with the transport of vitamin A into the system and the maintenance of homeostasis within the system. The genes have had millions of years to develop these mechanisms to regulate these sort of stuff. It's only when crackpots basically view them in a reductionist way, they see, some strange things happening. Yes, a lot of the studies that show association are in people that have got underlying disease problems and stuff like that. And that doesn't tell you anything else that other than there is association. It's association with a lot of things. You can associate countless things with disease state. It doesn't mean that any of these, whether it's TMAO or whether it's cholesterol or whether it's LDL or whether it's whatever, is causal. All it is an association. Okay, so let me just, oops, where was that? No, it's back here. Yeah, here it is. Sorry about that. Okay, so they're also looking at this study here, crosstalk between signaling vitamin A transporter and retinol binding protein receptor. So they are looking at basically the crosstalk, the communication and all that. And they do mention here that, basically, the interaction with the retinol binding protein and the STRA6 expression tissues such as adipose tissue and muscle induces the gene that encodes suppressor of cytokine signaling 3, as SOX3 is a potential inhibitor of insulin signaling. These findings provide a clear rationale for understanding how elevated levels of the retinol binding protein in blood of obese animals results in insulin resistance. Now, that just tells you there's an association. Is there some other mechanism? Why do we know that there is some other condition that may be playing a role here? We don't know. Okay, we know that this mediates the uptake of vitamin A by cells and they don't know. They know that it actually mediates, but even here, some of the mechanics or the mechanisms in the way it gets uptaken by, and the role of the RBPs, which is the retinol binding proteins, and their interaction with the cells and cell receptors and stuff like that. Some of this stuff is just a bit unclear in that regard. And so to make then assumptions, just because, you know, as I say, interestingly, it was recently reported that these SNPs in STR6 are associated with type 2 diabetes in humans. That's all they are, associated. This is, again, a lot of associational studies, and people are making a whole lot of reductionist arguments based on associational studies. We've heard them before. There's nothing new here. The vegetated have been hitting us over the head with associational inferences of different, you know, whether TMAO or anything else, LDL, cholesterol, and whatever else for years. Okay, a lot of the crackpots out there. Whether the effects result from alterations in STRA6 mediated vitamin A uptake or signaling remains to be clarified. Basically, we don't know fucking shit what really is going on and what the real relationship, whether it's a dubious relationship, a real relationship or not. I suspect not. And I'll tell you why my suspicions are that it's probably not. How can anything, you know, that something that humans have consumed? We know that basically, I mean, he basically argues against butter. He argues against dairy products in the same way because it's high in retinol and like liver and stuff like that. But if we look at ancestral societies, what did they do? They consumed liver. They consumed basically dairy products like the Maasai. A lot of the Europeans consumed dairy products for, you know, Greeks up until very recent, still now, but in the 70s, I remember some people nearly every day consuming, you know, little bits of liver or kokoretsu, which is all the organ meats wrapped in that intestinal and all that. So if there was something there would be a problem. Back in the 1970s, people were consuming 50% animal-based foods, but they were out in the sun. So they were getting vitamin D, vitamin A, MK4 from the liver and the dairy products. Not a problem. Go forward and we have the nutritional guidelines, and we drop our diet and our intake. And then we also have the crackpots telling us just because our skin was burning much more because of the incorporation of oxidized fats from seed oils. And we started slapping on a whole lot of products, chemical garbage, in order to reduce UVB exposure. And as a consequence, our vitamin D levels collapsed, and our reductions of animal products to highly processed animal products of 30% nowadays have basically seen dramatic increases in both deficiencies in vitamin A and deficiencies in vitamin D. So I can't understand, you know, how we could reduce these foods and we've got more problems. It just does not make sense. Just logically, it makes no sense. You know, these are stupid relationships. You know, the likelihood that one causes the other is not, because then we would have to explain how populations in the past ate more organ meats, even in developed countries like Western countries. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, people ate more organ meats. It was basically in the late 70s and early 80s where they basically abandoned a lot of these organ meat consumption. Some societies still keep it to this day, like the Greek society and a few others, much reduced compared to the past, but still consume some of these animal products. But in the past, people consumed everything because they valued these foods. They didn't have any problems. How come now we've all got these problems? Why liver, dairy products are basically a danger. And as I said, my great-grandfather lived on meat, organ meats and dairy, and lived to 107. And even my grandfather loved eating kukuretsi, which is organ meats and all that. So, and he was in his 87 when he died from pneumonia. Didn't die from any from basically, that from cardiovascular disease or cancer or anything like that, just pneumonia, because he was too stubborn to go to the doctor, to come down from the mountain and basically, get himself sorted. So he was a bit careless in that regard. But at the end of the day, he was healthy up until that point and had none of these problems, had no autoimmune diseases or any of these problems that this guy basically attributes to vitamin A toxicity. I would say to him, the onus is on him to prove with a biopsy of his own liver and that of the other people, and also to do one of vitamin D before he makes claims, unsupported claims. I would suspect that it's basically, that they're basically deficient both in K and D. I'd put good money on that. That is a strong likelihood, or there is some other issue, unresolved issue that these people have. Remember, even Judy actually pointed out that there's, autoimmunity and other things that are driven by leaky gut and all sorts of issues. Maybe these people haven't resolved those issues. So there are other potential possibilities of the things that could be playing a role there. Now, let me just share this screen again. Okay, so we know the typical stuff about vitamin A antagonism. Cod liver oil is, and they talk about the vitamin A toxicity. But we know that people have been consuming cod liver oil in the British Isles and Scandinavia, many areas, for decades. They never had a problem. But also some of the foods, cod liver oil is a good source of vitamin D as well. Plus, there are a number of other sources as well, like some of the seafood that a lot of these populations consumed. Plus, the green grass, the hardy green grass, is very high in both omega-3s, but also in vitamin D. So it increases the vitamin D content, also the ruminants. And we know that in Iceland, the people that lived inlands that were dependent on eating ruminants like sheep had very similar vitamin D levels to those who were coastal that were consuming a number of fish sources that were high in vitamin D. So that is why they basically never got into these toxicity levels, because they basically had both in the diet, and cod liver oil that he demonizes provides both, as long as it's a high quality one like the one that I talk about, a Rosita, that actually has good levels of both. We're not talking about sort of man-made crap that comes out of a lab that has a lot of other problems associated with it. Anyway, now this is a pretty good allergy research group. They actually put together some really good information and all that. I'll just go on some of this sort of stuff. This is sort of an overview. I'm not sort of promoting, supplements, but they do have here, like, modest regular doses of vitamin D can slowly and safely bring up to optimal levels, even in northern latitude. However, regular monitoring with blood tests is crucial due to genetic variations. And that's important. I mean, I've always said the best way to get it from the sun, because what happens is when you get a vitamin D from the sun, because it acts like a hormone in the body can basically regulate it much better. So that's why, unless you've actually got disease state, I usually only recommend 5,000 through through winter. And I don't recommend high doses that some other people do. High dose of vitamin D have been recommended today, have never been proven safe, especially long-term, and toxicity can be shown up overnight when fat stores become saturated and excess vitamin D spills into the blood. This can make many months to reverse. High dose of vitamin D may increase fracture risks in elderly women. Women aged 70, yes, you would think that basically, yes, but remember, you need basically both for osteocalcin, you need both vitamin A and vitamin D to work together in a balance, and then basically vitamin K2 to activate those proteins that are transcripted. Okay, so it doesn't surprise me that basically we find that high dose of vitamin have higher fall and fracture rates compared to women who receive placebo, because they're not causing an imbalance between vitamin A and. So this guy is basically promoting fractures in older people, because he's basically probably supplementing vitamin D or getting some vitamin D by being out in the sun, and by suppressing the amount of vitamin A, he will create this imbalance and basically end up causing people to have fractures in old age, because they won't be able to generate the proteins that are required for basically, the important, and also remember the important regulatory role of both vitamin D, vitamin A, and MK4, the important synergistic role that they play in terms of the regulation of the matrix metalloproteinase collagen degrading enzymes. And so that's another element, which we won't go into this because that's not the purpose. It's just to show that the illogicality of the argument of this person, that a species appropriate diet will give you all a very balanced, synergistic intake of these vitamins, whether from the sun or from foods, animal-based foods, will give you that and basically provide you with those synergies to work properly in your body. Vitamin A deficiency is more common than we realize, and that is fucking true, because vitamin A rich foods rarely eaten, and vitamin A toxicity has been overblown, definitely, to our profound immunological detriment. And that is very important, because remember, not only do we have receptors within the immune system, which are vitamin D receptors, we also have receptors for vitamin A. Even in the prostate, the actual prostate, the actual lungs and all that, when it comes to cancer, the enzymes that control proliferation and all that are vitamin A and vitamin D working together. So if you basically induce, a deficiency of one or the other, for whatever reason, in any way you do it, you'll have problems. Both in, the immune system not working properly, autoimmunist, in most cases, a vitamin D deficiency in the modern world, and to some extent, potentially also a vitamin A deficiency. It depends on the person. It depends on what they're doing, what their lifestyle is like. It will vary depending on the person. That's why when I see autoimmunity, I always ask people, tell me what you're eating, what your lifestyle's like and all that, to try and work out what are the potential elements that may be at play. Vitamin A is necessary for optimal mucosal immunity. When we're talking about the barriers, the mucosal barriers, that's what we're talking about. And a key nutrient in balancing the newly discovered pro-inflammatory cytokine interleukin-17. So this person basically wants you to have worse leaky gut issues in the long run by promoting a diet deficient in vitamin A, let alone because for the mucosal immunity and all that, and the actual also the functioning of the tight junctions together mucosal layer, you need both vitamin D and vitamin A. And MK4 also plays a role. So if you're basically not eating certain foods like dairy, liver, and stuff like that, so you're not getting the vitamin A or the MK4, because you're avoiding those foods, and then you're eating lean meats, you're eliminating all the fat-soluble vitamins by eating lean meats, and then you're either deficient in sun or not deficient in sun, creating even further imbalances and all that, things are not going to work really well in the long run. Let's put it that way. Carotenoids cannot be adequate or safe substitute for vitamin A. That's, in this case, I would say food sources, not supplements. This is about supplements, but I would, always say, because basically, new research has shown that there are not efficiently converted to vitamin A, and that's true. We know that basically beta carotenes and all that, some people basically, and he even mentions it himself, that beta carotene builds up in the skin and creates skin issues. Yeah, but that's because it can't be converted. That's like plant form. We carnivores know that that's shit, and that's why we always talk against it. And there we go. New research, and let me just move that now. And they can create cleavage products that can form free radicals, interrupt vitamin A protective functions, and thereby potentially raise the risk for cancer. So high levels of carotenoids, which is what is our vegan diet and all that, can create pro-inflammatory free radicals that can actually potentially create these risks. How much? I'm not going to say that basically, that there's probably many other elements in an inappropriate diet that can actually synergistically work together towards that. So I wouldn't actually, make this claim as strong, in my personal opinion, but it adds to the sort of the effects or the damaging effects together with other elements within a poor diet. Most important, vitamin D and vitamin A are an ancient and inseparable team. And that is fucking the important thing that evolution has honed through time. They must be supplemented together in order to create a functional, to not create a functional deficiency of either one. And that is important. And that is why being out in the sun and eating a species appropriate diet will basically furnish you good levels of vitamin A, vitamin D, and MK4. And your body will work properly because it will have what it needs for those enzymatic pathways to work properly. Anyway, excess D will create a relative deficiency in A, and even when dietary levels are adequate, and vice versa. A good marriage is complementary, and a good marriage of vitamin A and vitamin D allows the two nutrients to balance, enhance, and contain each other through the ancient steroid. That's why I said they act like very much like a hormone, because they are pretty much through the ancient steroid receptor, RXR. The all-important results, which cannot be achieved with either nutrient alone, is a beautiful functional immune system that does not veer into autoimmune disease or have trouble handling pathogens. And as we know, a healthy immune system is tightly linked to a healthy nervous system. And that's exactly it. A species-appropriate diet with adequate sun or supplementation of vitamin D. And we're not talking about excess, what I usually recommend, because about 5,000 I use per day in winter. And normally I recommend sun as much as possible rather than getting it from some animal foods where you'll get it to the desired amounts. The sun being the most important. Maximize it in the sun in the summertime, and basically just supplement in the winter if you have to. If you can get to the tropics like I do, even better. Vitamin D is the only molecule that we create ourselves from light and turn into a hormone, 25-OHD. An astounding feat when you think about it. Similar, vitamin A obtained through the diet and other dietary lipid-based nutrients that we turn into a hormone, retinoic acid. Vitamin K brings up the rear like a good third team play, and enhances vitamin D impact on bone and protects against kidney damage from excess D. That's the importance of because prevents what are they talking about here when they talk about kidneys? They're talking about basically calcium metabolism. So really important on that side of the K type the top vitamin K experts in this country, Sarah Booth, PhD of Turf University, speculates that K may also work through the ancient RXR receptor, just like DNA, but has not been studied yet. That's true. There has been more information. We will show some research on that. Finally, vitamin A seems to play a role as well, working together with vitamin A and D. Fat-soluble vitamins are likely to be the best absorbed when accompanied by a fatty meal or in fish oil, which is cod liver oil in this case. What we take these vitamins with is important as the vitamins themselves. Thus, safe and balanced dose of A, D, K, and E in an oil base is likely to lead to optimal health. It depends, you know, there's always a caveat with E. Now, you don't need as much E. You need the other tocotrienols as well, the other smaller. So you need it from a balance from an animal or plant source like palm oil, which basically has that complex. Now, the other thing is when you're like vitamin C, when you're basically on a species appropriate diet, you're less inflamed. So the requirement, and this is critical, the requirement for vitamin E goes down, because like vitamin C, its metabolites can become pro-oxidants, you know, once they've done the electron doning. The good thing about a species appropriate diet is glutathione goes up. And as glutathione goes up, it basically recycles these by electron doning. So they don't need to be, you know, what you get from the food is all you need. Critical parts is that we get sufficient vitamin A and MK4 and D in the diet and through the sun for good functioning. And they talk about further here about, you know, the deficiencies that are in different populations. This is in particular about Americans. The marriage of vitamin D and vitamin A, a match made on Earth, you know, and there's a lot of, I'll put a link so people can read the rest of it and all that, and the importance of both in our body in that regard. So unfortunately, this one was actually retracted. It had some good information, but I'll move on. This one's looking at this is a subcomponent of the RXR. Okay, so PXR. So this study is showing the pathway of vitamin K. So invertebrates like us, in reproduction and stuff like that. So, you know, you can see all these pathways, how they intersect, constantly intersecting. So very important. You know, we know that this ancient pathway intersects vitamin A, vitamin D, and MK4. And, you know, the K, you know, here talking about MK4, you know, the administration, but primarily, you know, the big one is MK4. We know that. Coming from a species appropriate diet. This is the RXR receptor. Again, you know, looking at the relationship between these different proteins. I'll attach this to other people that may want to look into it. Exploring this pathway, which DNA, you know, again, you know, when we're talking about pathophysiology functions and all that sort of stuff, you know, we always have to understand, you know, that these mechanisms are at play. It doesn't mean they're causal, but they're involved. They may be deranged in some way or affected in some way or whatever. Anyway, this is the critical part that I did want to show, is how that basically to bring it back to the K where if we go back to, remember this one where they're actually talking about down here that they not enough information about this receptor, which is that ancient receptor. Oops, not that one. This one here. So vitamin K induces osteoblast differentiation through pregnenolone X receptor. Now that receptor, remember, okay, so there's the receptor. So when we're looking at this receptor here, which is that one that we were talking about, the PXR is a subtype of that. Okay, just so we understand. I'm not going to go into the, to confuse you guys. I just want to show the relationship. Thus, the findings suggest the feasibility that osteoprotective vitamin K action mediated in transcription control of VK target genes via the PXR, SXR, in fact, several, and we basically know that that is a subclass of this one, which vitamin D and vitamin A are involved with. This is where the relationship does exist between those things and how they're interacting. Again, we don't know enough about, we're still learning. We're still in that early stage of learning, which is very important to understand. We're still trying to understand or get a handle of how these sort of mechanisms work, how they're interacting, how the different genes are interplaying with the nutrients and things that we furnish. But the reality is we know that there are relationships and there are associations, which the crackpots like to basically use reductionist thinking and come up with their own bizarre relationships that defy the logic and reality. Because you have to basically demonstrate, if you basically say, there is an association, most of these associations are piss poor associations, 50%, 30%. That basically just means, I know it's, me and Bart fucking hate the concept of a risk ratio. It's not, it's an odds ratio. It's a statistical relative odds ratio. And that odds ratio, that relative relationship is basically, 1.17 is 17%, or, there are always these low percentage marks. So what is that telling you? It's not even statistically strong enough to require, or to be able to even generate a new hypothesis on that. So he doesn't have he can't show me one study that actually shows statistically, like thousands of orders of magnitude. So when vitamin A goes up, massive disease goes up, like with we see basically in the tobacco studies. We can see increase in tobacco consumption, disease goes up, reduction goes down, dose dependent, and thousands of orders of magnitude, and we've seen that, it was in Britain, there was a massive reduction in the admissions. They had brought in legislation, I can't remember in which city in London, in the UK, and they actually said that people can't smoke outdoors in certain areas. And what happened was there was a considerable reduction of and this is absolute reduction, not relative. This is an absolute reduction of something like 30 odd percent. And there was something similar in the US. I can't remember which city, and there was legislation to ban outdoor smoking, and then the Republicans got into, were able to get the more power in that local, that state government, and basically overturn that legislation. But while that legislation was in effect, there was a massive reduction in people being admitted with heart diseases who also smoked. So basically, heart disease incidence went down markedly in absolute terms, not in relative terms, but in absolute terms, markedly. And the same thing happened in Britain. So we've got two different countries. It's something that I will, in a future video, I will be showing those studies. Plus, I'll be showing how endothelial dysfunction also is associated with a lot of this, is related, mechanistically to a lot of these sort of things. And so, thinking that you can actually use through other means, that's not going to save you from endothelial dysfunction. But anyway, that's a side issue. Didn't want to go there, but that's how you have to look, and that's why there is strong inference. Again, it's not causal, but it's inference. That is, it's so strong that you can nearly, that's what we call it, when you say something is causal, that means you can actually prove definitively mechanism and you can replicate it. When there is a strong statistical relationship, that the likelihood that it's something else is unlikely, that is called basically a strong statistical inference of inferring causation. So you're not proving absolute, but you're inferring from strong statistical. That's what the Bradford Hill criteria actually shows, that once you increase tobacco consumption or reduce, the disease will go up or down in that regard. So it actually quite clearly can demonstrate that. And that's really important that we understand that. What these studies that are showing relationships between retinol or vitamin D or whatever are all associational claptrap studies that show and infer very little. They don't even show dose dependency. That means if you increase vitamin D or increase retinol, things do not get worse. Sometimes they get better. That means it goes against the whole argument. Either something is, you can infer it and it will continue getting worse or better. If it goes the other way, it basically immediately means that hypothesis is wrong, because you can't have one group showing one thing and another group showing another thing. That means there is no real relationship. It's like, when you've got a statistical, like a scatter board, you've got dots all over the place. They don't follow a linear progression. This guy cannot demonstrate linear progression with retinol. So basically he's got no argument. And I would call him out to say, you show me a linear progression. You show me the evidence. You've got nothing. You show me that you've basically got no deficiency in vitamin D, and you've got basically high levels of toxicity with a liver biopsy. Just can't basically speculate, because we know that, there's plenty in the literature and also clinical studies that actually show increasing vitamin D will reverse a lot of autoimmunity. So basically, it could be a vitamin D deficiency. Especially if you're eating a lot of organ meats, some carnivores, and are deficient in vitamin D, they can actually make a vitamin D deficiency worse, creating an autoimmunity worse. That doesn't mean they're in toxic levels of vitamin A. It just means that they're basically not getting sufficient vitamin D. There's a difference between toxicity and difference between imbalance. That's a different thing altogether. So unless I clinically have these people tested, I don't know what's happening. But I'm just bringing up potential things that may be happening. As far as I'm concerned, the assumptions and the arguments that they're putting forward are crackpot ideas. Absolutely crackpot ideas, because when we look at ancient populations, when we look at the Maasai consuming, living older age with no health problems whatsoever, an 80-year-old that can outrun Mary up a hillside, that person is consuming a diet rich in retinol foods from animal products, plus dairy products and has no problems. And this guy's saying, do not touch the butter, do not touch the dairy food, it's going to kill you, is absolute nonsense. They are healthy on a species appropriate diet out in the sun. We are not. And to use reductionism to argue for changes when reality shows us, an ancestral reality shows us something different, is just nonsense. Don't fall for the crackpots and the reductionists. That's what this guy is. That's what the Ray Peat people are. And the vegetators are the same when it comes to LDL and, things like TMAO and whatever else. It's the same bullshit. And they've got no real science. All they've got is these associations. And they're basically misinforming people and putting people's lives at risk as well, or making their health at least worse, not helping them at all, So we've seen it before. Nothing new. It's the same nonsense which we got with the MTHFR issues and stuff like that. And riboflavin corrects it when it comes to that genetic SNP. It's the same sort of reductionist nonsense that people, continue to just perpetuate. Let's not fall for it. Our species, has been consuming these foods for millions of years, 3.5 million years. That's what the N15 data shows. The nitrogen 15 isotopes are very high, which makes us super hyper carnivores. And we consumed animal-based foods, and that is why we're around with and so successful as a species. Let's not listen to crackpots like this and degenerate ourselves and make things even worse. We went from 50% animal foods in the 1950s with a lot of dairy and meat to very little now and a lot of kibble and deficiencies of all sorts, and that's why we're unhealthy. And let's just not stop creating, phantom associations to basically push reductionist nonsense or to push books and whatever else and supplements and other crappy ideas that these people like to peddle for their own self-interests. Anyway, that's my opinion when it comes to this sort of stuff. I think he's a crackpot. And I think that the people who are associated with him are a crackpot. I wouldn't give him the day on my channel at all. I think that Judy did a disservice to her. I subscribe to her because she's got some good information. She's a good lady, but I think she did a disservice to her subs. I think that this guy's peddling very dangerous information and we should not listen to it. It's nonsense, guys. It's associational claptrap. It's nonsense. So I hope you enjoyed this. Anyway, I'll leave it at that and see yous.